if I aim for that sort of volume, will that reach to the back? It's a real pleasure to be with you. I am channeling my inner imposter because I'm addressing the Prayer Book Society, and I am absolutely no liturgist, as some of my colleagues across the way will no doubt tell you if you ask them. I'm only a jobbing parson, but I am at the moment a parson charged with looking after Salisbury Cathedral. So I thought, on receiving your invitation, that I'd tell you, or try to tell you, one of the stories from Salisbury's past, as that's where I serve and that's where we're meeting. And to bring to light, bring to the surface, a story which perhaps ought to be told more often than it has been. And I'm going to start with a quote that some of you will recognise, I'm sure, and it touches upon a far more prominent figure from Salisbury's history, who needs no introduction at all. Here it is. Mr. Herbert's chiefest recreation was music, in which heavenly art he was a most excellent master, and did himself compose many divine hymns and anthems, which he set and sung to his lute or viol. And although he was a lover of retiredness, yet his love to music was such that he went usually twice every week on certain appointed days to the Cathedral church in Salisbury, and at his return would say that his time spent in prayer and cathedral music elevated his soul and was his heaven upon earth. But before his return thence to Bemerton, he would usually sing and play his part at an appointed private music meeting. And to justify this practice, he would often say, "Religion does not banish mirth, but only moderates and sets rules to it." Isaac Walton's famous description of the country parson setting out on his regular walk across the meadows to attend evensong at Salisbury Cathedral has become part of the mythology both of George Herbert and of this place, the place that I serve. John Daniel published a biography of Herbert late in the 19th century, and Daniel insists that even after his final illness had forced Herbert to relinquish public prayer in the parish, still he came one last time to evensong in Salisbury early in 1633. So, beyond coming to pray, whose company did George Herbert seek when he set out on those twice weekly walks? With whom did he make music while he was here in the cathedral close? Walton's life was published in 1670. At that time, Humphrey Henchman was Bishop of London, a post to which he was appointed in 1663 and which he held until his death in 1670. Bishop Henchman was one of the sources who Walton consulted as he wrote his life of Herbert, because more than 40 years earlier, Henchman had served here. He had been installed as the prebendary of Yatesbury, here in Salisbury Cathedral, and as the precentor, or chanter, as it was then more often known, in the historic foundation of New Salem. Henchman's term here, serving as a canon on the chapter, overlapped with Herbert's service in Bemerton. Walton records that Henchman would not speak of Herbert without, as he puts it, some veneration for Mr. Herbert's life and excellent learning. But this wasn't just affected piety. Henchman had assisted at Herbert's priestly ordination and at his funeral. He tells me, writes Walton, he laid his hands on Mr. Herbert's head and, alas, within 3 years lent his shoulder to carry his dear friend to his grave. It's not too much to suppose that a young Humphrey Henchman was one of those with whom a young George Herbert spent his musical afternoons here in Salisbury. John Aubrey, another of Herbert's early biographers, records that Herbert was buried, as he puts it, according to his own desire, with the singing service for the burial of the dead by the singing men of Sarum. Henchman, as precentor, would surely have made the necessary arrangements for his friend's funeral. Humphrey Henchman, George Herbert's companion and fellow music maker, is my subject this afternoon. I must confess that it was Henchman's splendid surname that first sparked my interest in him. Surely no prelate of the 17th century had a better one, Bishop Henchman. Casson's Lives of the Bishop of Salisbury throws some light upon the name's origin. Casson suggests that the family's ancestral name was Crosborough, much less interesting. That changed in the very early Tudor period, when a Crosborough spent a day hunting with Henry VII. He kept up with the king throughout an exhausting day in a long and hard-fought chase, at the end of which the king turned to him and said, "Sirrah, thou art a veritable henchman." The word apparently had a more benign meaning in that era. He might as well have said, "Thou art a veritable attendant," or a veritable companion. Anyway, the name stuck. Now, whether that's true or not, we have no means of knowing. But the family coat of arms, the Henchman coat of arms, features 3 bugle horns. So it's nice to think that the name has its origin in that day spent hunting with Henry VII. You can see the coat of arms on the back of the stall in the choir at Salisbury Cathedral, which bears the name Alton Australis. Anyhow, approximately 100 years after that afternoon hunting, Humphrey Henchman was born. He was baptised in Barton Seagrave, Northamptonshire, on the 22nd of December 1592. His uncle, Owen Owens, was the parish priest there. His mother's family had Welsh roots. And Henchman's father, Thomas Henchman, traded as a skinner in London. Young Humphrey went to university in Cambridge at Christ's. He took his BA in 1613, his MA 3 years later, and he was then appointed a Fellow of Clare Hall. He owed that appointment to his grandmother, whose family had endowed 2 fellowships at Clare, and one of which came his way. And on went his career as a Fellow of Clare. In the decade after becoming a Fellow, he took the degrees of Bachelor of Divinity and then Doctor of Divinity. And ultimately, early in the 1620s, was installed here in Salisbury. He married shortly after he got here, and he married rather advantageously. Robert Towson had been consecrated Bishop of Salisbury in July 1620, but he died only 10 months later, leaving a widow and a large family in need of provision. John Davenant was appointed as bishop in succession. Bishop Davenant, rather conveniently, you might think, was the brother of Bishop Dowson's widow and was a bachelor. So Mrs. Towson got to remain in the bishop's palace in order to keep house for her brother, and she was able to ensure that her daughters Gertrude, Ellen, Margaret, Judith and Maria were all married off. Gertrude to a close resident, Margaret to one prebendary, Judith to another, and Maria to another. Ellen, who was daughter number 2, married Humphrey Henchman. The cathedral registers record the baptism of a son, John, on the 7th of February 1625. The child was buried at Alderbury only 13 days later, as was too often the way in the early 17th century. The Stuart monarchs were, of course, frequent visitors to Salisbury throughout Henchman's early years here, and the relationship that was forged in those years was to have a significant consequence for Humphrey, and I think allow me to speak of him as the king's henchman. We know that James I came as a guest to the bishop's palace, where Henchman's mother-in-law was housekeeper, and we know that Charles I visited both before and after his accession to the throne in 1625. He spent some days here in 1632, and it's recorded that he attended the daily services at the cathedral, the services that Henchman would have overseen through the singing men of the day. Henchman would have got to know the Stuart family. But the 1620s ended badly so far as music making here was concerned. On his arrival, Henchman would have worked with John Holmes, the chorister's music teacher. Holmes died in January 1629. The struggle to succeed him can best be described as epic. It ought to become a Netflix series, and its echoes were heard in the loftiest reaches of the kingdom. Henchman cannot but have been involved. He was the presenter, after all. So, after his death, John Holmes's family, led by his widow Dulcibella, a redoubtable figure, remained in the chorister's house on Bishop's Walk, and united around the candidacy of her son Thomas Holmes for the post that was now vacant. Thomas Holmes was supported by Bishop Davenant and by 3 members of chapter. But the dean, John Bowl, favoured one Giles Tomkins as the new master of the choristers. Tomkins was supported by 3 members of the chapter. The chapter met on the 14th of April. Tomkins had 4 chapter votes, Holmes had 3. However, the Bishop of Salisbury was, and to this day remains, the prebendary of Potterne, And on that basis, Bishop Davenant weighed in and claimed to exercise a vote on chapter. Now, the numbers were equally divided, 4-4, deadlock in the chapter house. The dean tried to outflank the bishop by appointing Giles Tomkins as a lay vicar, a singing man in the cathedral, and admitted him as such, as was his right. Bishop Davenant said that this action was void in law and by rights none. The dean would have none of it and took Tomkins to the chorister's house on Bishop's Walk in order to put him in possession of it. The bishop followed behind. What a sight it must have been! The dean ordered Dulcinella Holmes to leave the chorister's house. The bishop commanded her to stay, and she did just that. So the argument in chapter resumed, and the dean appealed to the Archbishop of Canterbury, George Abbott. The Archbishop appointed a committee to consider the matter. Isn't it a relief to know that very little changes? The Archbishop chaired the committee, and the poet dean of St Paul's, John Donne, was a member of it. The committee considered the matter and wrote on the 22nd of June 1629 to King Charles I in these terms: "We find not reason to think otherwise than that Giles Tomkins was lawfully elected." And then weasel words: "Yet notwithstanding we submit all unto your princely pleasure." The king responded with remarkable speed. Only 6 days later, slightly less commendable was the clarity of expression. This was to get King Charles into an awful lot of trouble later on, as we know. Charles's edict said, "His Majesty doth require that the within named Giles Tomkins be omitted by way of provision into the places now in question." By way of provision roughly translates as provisionally. So, that was ambiguous and supremely unhelpful. And when the chapter met on the 16th of July, John Holmes's supporters seized upon them. "It's only provisional," they said. So, deadlock again, with Dulcinella and her family still in the house. Without a house that could readily be used for the instruction of the choristers, there could be no choristers and no music. By October, the dean was proposing to the chapter that some boys from the city be brought in and appointed to sing, their payment coming from the payment for choristers that was accruing in the chapter accounts. And despite the dean's directions, despite the loss of singers, the Holmes supporters remained stoutly in possession, and the dispute passed to the courts. The Chancery proceedings, dated 5th of November 1629, records the history and concludes: "The choristers of the cathedral cannot be taught and instructed by reason of the detention of the said house, whereby the said cathedral church will be utterly unfurnished of choristers, and the service of God in the said church left unperformed, if the possession of the said house be not speedily established by some order of the court." On it went. Only in December 1630 was the Holmes family ordered to leave for another house in the close. It's difficult to imagine that Henchman would not have taken the bishop's side in the dispute. After all, the bishop's housekeeper was his mother-in-law, and one can only imagine the power that lady might have exercised. Perhaps it's because Bishop Davenant needed another supporter in the cathedral foundation that in 1633 he had Henchman appointed to a vacant residentiary canonry. He'd been prebendary and he'd been the chanter there too. In 1633 he gets a residentiary canonry, and it's thought that he went to live in the house that we know as the South Canonry. It wasn't an uncontroversial appointment. Henchman's elevation disadvantaged two other prebendaries who were themselves hopeful of residential canonries. These petitioned the king and the new Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, to register their opposition. But Charles I, perhaps remembering those happy trips to Salisbury, confirmed Henchman's appointment. So, Laud is the new Archbishop, and Laud is determined that the English Church should manifest two qualities in its life and in its worship: uniformity and excellence, looking for the levers by means of which he might encourage such excellence and enforce such uniformity. He claimed the right to hold visitations throughout the province of Canterbury. This did not go down at all well with the Bishop of Lincoln, who, it so happens, is a relative of Henchman's and a former Dean of Salisbury. He objected to Laud's claiming this right, and the Attorney General had to resolve the matter, directed that the Lord Archbishop of Canterbury of right ought to visit metropolitically the churches and dioceses of his province. In consequence, between 1634 and 1637, Laud's Vicar General, Sir Nathaniel Brent, set about the task with vigour. The visitation of Salisbury Cathedral took place in 1634, 1 year after Henchman had arrived into his residentiary canonry. The findings of the visitation are preserved in the library of the House of Lords, and in them Henchman begins to emerge from the shadows. Brent posed 29 questions of the dean, canons and prebendaries of the Cathedral Church of Sarum, and 12 questions of the vicars choral, priests, vicars, singing men, choristers and the rest of ye choir of the said cathedral. The questions were wide-ranging and revelatory of Laud's agenda. They address the chapter's adherence to the statutes and ordinances of the cathedral, the presence in Salisbury or absence from Salisbury of the residentiary canons, the regularity of their attendance at worship, their habits of almsgiving or hospitality, the condition of the cathedral building and the buildings of the close, and many other matters beside. Henchman is clearly keen to impress his superiors and his interrogators. One of his canonical colleagues describes the hospitality that Henchman offers here as laudable. His entertainment is frequent and fair. The same colleague describes Henchman as a regular attender at morning and evening prayer, and as diligent in restraining those who would disturb divine service by their movement and their clamour during it. But Henchman does not return the favour. Writing for himself in his answers to the questions, he is not slow to criticise his colleagues. Hospitality, he writes, is not kept by any of the canons residentiary, according to the ancient laudable customs of our church. There is a great neglect in most of the canons in coming to morning and evening prayer. I present, moreover, that the canons residentiary do not wear their square caps, according to the 74th canon and ancient customs of the church. He also bemoans the lack of copes. Most of them had been sold 60 years earlier, and the remainder turned into pulpit cloths and cushions. And Henchman observes that there is a great defect of ornaments about the altar. In the margins, Archbishop Laud writes, "Let it be looked to." Lastly, Henchman is quick to draw the conduct of his colleague Dr. Seward to the authorities' attention. There is a great scandal and reproach raised against our church in the city, Henchman writes. Apparently, Seward has engineered the separation of a kinswoman of his from her husband on the pretense that he has used her cruelly. Seward has had the unfortunate husband imprisoned for 13 months and has encouraged his kinswoman to pursue him for alimony through the ecclesiastical courts. Meanwhile, Seward has accommodated this said kinswoman at his house after a costly manner, Henchman notes, and it gets better. And he has allowed one William Shackle to visit her there almost daily, despite the chapter's warning that he should not. Eyebrows in the close were clearly being raised, and the 17th century equivalent of neck curtains were plainly twitching. Again, how good it is to know that very few things change. Again, the Archbishop notes in the margins, this is a great neglect, and I find many particulars fall upon Dr. Seward. The Visitation did not pose detailed questions about the canon's habits of pluralism, their habits of holding a number of ecclesiastical offices simultaneously and drawing an income from all of them. Perhaps that's just as well. By 1640, Henchman had accumulated quite a fistful. He became Vicar of Rushden in Northamptonshire in 1624. He presented himself to the rectory of Westbury in 1629, and in 1640 he received from the Bishop of Winchester, another former prebendary of Salisbury, the benefices of Portland and White Regis in Dorset. He was doing well. And then, of course, the Civil War engulfed the land, with catastrophic consequences for those like Henchman who held high ecclesial office. He was deprived of his canonical residence and of his canonry and of his other livings, but we should not weep for him. Family connections meant that he retained some land in Wiltshire, in Dorset and in Lincolnshire. And when he was deprived of the rectory of Portland, he was considered to be of such means that he should not receive, or he need not receive, even the 1/5 of parish revenues that were customarily given to those who, like him, were deprived. It's believed that he continued to reside in Salisbury. He left the South Canonry and returned, we believe, to the house he'd occupied as a prebendary, which was a small house somewhere near the old deanery on what is now the Sarum St. Michael site. The story picks up, though, in 1651. Charles II, newly crowned in Scotland, marched south and engaged Cromwell's army at Worcester unsuccessfully. Charles fled the field and, as is well known, took refuge in an oak tree and then in sundry other places, assisted by a network of sympathisers and friends. Among these was Humphrey Henchman. If his ancestor had gained his name because of his ability to keep up with a king, then his descendant lived up to it. It was obviously imperative that King Charles flee these shores, and it was Henchman's suggestion that he should hide out at Heel House near Salisbury until a ship might be made ready. The suggestion was made after a secret meeting here in the Close, a consultation between Henchman and Mr. Coventry, who then resided at Malmesbury House. Mr. Coventry's domestic chaplain was sent to King Charles, and King Charles arrived at Heel after dark on the 6th of October, 1651. Mrs. Hyde, the lady of the house, recognised her royal guest immediately, but said nothing until after supper. And at supper that night, Henchman was one of the guests. And it was Henchman among the party who conducted the king to his chamber, where they had, we're told, a long private conversation. Charles hid out at Heel for 6 days. Then on the 12th of October came news of a ship that had been made ready at Shoreham. The following day, the king left the house by the back door and met Henchman, who acted as his guide. They walked to Clarendon Park Corner, where horses were waiting, and then proceeded to Hambledon. On the 15th of October, the king embarked and landed safely at Facon. As you know, King Charles was restored to the kingdom on the 29th of May, 1660. The chapter of Salisbury met for the first time since the beginning of the Civil War, on the 13th of September, and they met much reduced. The dean and 2 of the residentiaries had survived, one of them was Henchman, 19 of the prebendal stalls were vacant, and 3 of the 4 archdeaconries were vacant. 11 days after that chapter meeting, the Bishop Brian Dupper was translated to Winchester, and the see of Salisbury fell vacant. Who was to succeed Bishop Dupper? Well, given the history, perhaps Henchman's preferment was unsurprising. Although not wanting to hedge his bets, he wrote to the King's Secretary of State, urging him to plead his cause with King Charles. It so happens, as is so often the case in this story, that the Secretary of State's brother was Henchman's fellow residentiary canon and master of St Nicholas's Hospital here in Salisbury. Henchman was appointed and was consecrated bishop of this diocese on the 28th of October 1660 at Westminster Abbey. He served here only 3 years, but they were not idle years. First, he confirmed new statutes for the cathedral. All these years later, it's a process that we're re-embarking on, pursuant to the new cathedral's measure, passing the General Synod and receiving royal assent. Henchman's statutes read as the work of someone who has seen cathedral life from the inside, with all its quirks and peculiarities, and as the work of someone who is determined that the chaos of the Civil War and Commonwealth periods will be overcome and newly tightly regulated. Henchman required an annual reading of the statutes on the Feast of Pentecost, and the gathering together of all the cathedral's scattered registers, volumes, charters, or other instruments into the muniment house. He directed that the prebendaries of the cathedral ought not to repair unwillingly to the performance of their duties owing to the same. Chief among these is preaching, and prebendaries are enjoined in the statutes to preach or to risk a fine of £5. All the properties in the close were to be inspected and a record to be made of their condition in a book compiled for that purpose. Henchman's other great task as diocesan was to play his part in the reintroduction of the Book of Common Prayer to the realm. He was one of the 12 bishops appointed by the king to meet with 12 Presbyterian divines at the Savoy Conference to agree the revision of the prayer book. The conference, as you know, proved abortive, but Henchman managed to impress Richard Baxter, who wrote this of him. Bishop Henchman was of the most grave, comely, reverent aspect of any of the bishops, and of good insight into the fathers and councils. He spoke calmly and slowly, and not very oft, but was as high in his principles and resolutions as any of them. I think that was a compliment. The conference over, Henchman was one of the committee of bishops appointed to undertake the work of revision. This was swiftly done, as you know, and copies of the sealed prayer book, corrected in pen and ink wherever necessary, were soon required to be obtained by the chapter of every cathedral and collegiate church in England. Salisbury's copy survives in the cathedral library. Humphrey Henchman is listed among the other bishops at the preface, and with our copy is a handwritten letter from the bishop to Mr. James Harris of the Close, which it's worth quoting in full, particularly in these days of Amazon. "Brother," he writes, "you shall receive by the waggoner of Salisbury a tin box with the Book of Common Prayer in it, and the great seal of England thereunto annexed, which is to be delivered unto Dr. Hyde, the commoner, to the dean and chapter. The book cost 40 shillings, and the great seal £7, in all £9, which I have paid here, and do require so much of the commoner for my use, together with money for the carriage, for the Act of Parliament orders that this shall be done at their cost, and they may see in the Act where they are to place it. Commend my love to the Charter, and all my friends with you, your loving brother, H. Selwyn." He was translated to the See of London in 1663, and was therefore bishop during the plague of 1665, when he refused to leave the city and insisted on doing what he could to relieve the needs of the poor, and during the Great Fire of 1666. That fire destroyed his cathedral, of course, and Henchman lived long enough to confer with Sir Christopher Wren to contribute regularly to the cost of rebuilding and to lay the first stone of the new St. Paul's, less than 4 months before his death. He's buried in the parish church of All Saints, Fulham. There, an inevitably cursory sketch of an extraordinary life. Think about it for a moment. Henchman bore the body of George Herbert to burial. He escorted his king into exile. He oversaw the final publication of the prayer book. He began the rebuilding of London's great cathedral. Arguably, he was at the bedside throughout the long birth of Anglicanism, present at the key events of that formative century. Insider and intriguer, politician and prelate, schemer and sufferer, administrator and advocate. His portrait still hangs in the old bishop's palace, His greying beard is carefully trimmed, his eyes are bright, and his countenance is gentle. A wooden effigy stands in the choir above the stall of Alton Australis, which bears his coat of arms. Ironically, it's one of the stalls he never held. And the effigy depicts him wearing the mitre he would never have worn, and it discloses little of the tumultuous times through which he lived, or the historic events in which he played a part. But he was the king's henchman, and I think he's worthy of our recollection. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, after that most interesting address, are there any questions, please? Yes, sir.
Is this the age of you know?
Well, I'm terrible at maths, but he was baptised in 1590. I mean, he had a long life. He was baptised in 1592, and he died in 1670. Yeah, so he did pretty well. He did pretty well.
No more questions?
Was he? I don't suppose he was ever permitted to marry. He wasn't the one with all the children.
He had a good number of children.
Yeah.
He married on arrival here in Salisbury. Married one of the daughters of the former bishop. So he made a useful marriage. And there was a child who died young. Then there were others. At least one of whom succeeded to a canonry here, of course, as was the way. Yeah.
Thank you.
No? All quiet? All satisfied?
When these canons held pluralities, did they appoint curates to actually take the services in these places in Lincolnshire and Falkland and so forth?
I suspect that practice was hugely varied, and I think if they were doing their job properly, then if you held the prebend of my prebend is Heytesbury as dean. So I think that in days gone by, I would have been expecting. It was understood that I wouldn't be in Heytesbury all the time, but yes, out of the revenue that the prebend generated for me, I would have been expected to appoint a curate who was an adequate preacher and so on to take care of the cure of souls in Heytesbury. And one of the points of Lord's visitation that Henchman then reinforced in his statutes was that as the holding of the prebend, I jolly well ought to turn up there every so often to keep an eye on things and make sure I did preach and so on and so forth. Where there came complaints about abuses were when I think somebody holding a prebend and a fistful of prebends were firstly never turning up there themselves to see how things were, and being negligent about the care of the, so that churches would fall to rack and ruin. There would be an illiterate curate who didn't know Genesis from Revelation and was incapable of reading the homilies or whatever. So those are the sorts of abuses that of course the Reformers set out to correct.
Thank you.
With Henchman came the Revd. After him, had he established it so well here, or did it then have a wall? I mean, was it really then part of?
No, by that stage we're beyond 1662, so it enters life. Then there's no serious challenge to it here. its place is established by law. Yeah.
John?
This was a time when there was a lot of building work going on in the close. They were building cages for the canons. Where did he actually live?
Well, we believe that his canonical residence, when he was the precentor, was in what we call the South Canonry, in whatever was on the site of the South Canonry. We're told that he, as a prebendary, he lived in one of the small prebends houses that was adjacent to the old deanery on the Sarum St Michael site.
Did you say he was buried in London?
Yeah, buried at All Saints, Fulham.
Why did he come back later?
He died as Bishop of London. There was at the time of his death, there was no possibility of his being buried in his cathedral because it was under construction. I guess his principal residence would have been Fulham Palace, because that's where the bishops of London lived. And All Saints, I don't know if you know it, but it is the parish church that's almost immediately adjacent to Fulham Parish, to Fulham Palace. So I guess he was buried in the parish church in the parish of which he died. So I suspect that's why. That's why. And he did a longer term as Bishop of London. I mean, he served as Bishop of London for 7 years. And despite his long history here as a canon, he was only here as bishop for 3 years.
Did his offspring go on to do great things?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. There were offspring, and there were offspring who were clergy. But I haven't followed that through well enough to know. I'm intrigued that Isaac Walton, who writes the famous Life of Herbert and Life of John Donne and everyone else, Isaac Walton's son was, of course, a residentiary canon of Salisbury, and that's why we have the Walton Canonry on the West Walk. Sons. They didn't have much option of following their father's footsteps, did they, in those days? But I don't know of particular distinctions.
Dear Nicholas, we're extremely grateful to you for drawing this very colourful picture of what life in the close and indeed in the Church of England was like in the early to mid-17th century. On the one hand, the saintly George Herbert, representing the calm and spiritual side of church life, which I suppose is epitomised in his book, The Priest of the Temple, and of course his very personal religious poetry. On the other, a good deal of contention and indeed scandal. One wonders how much George Herbert himself knew of the involvement of his friend, Canon Henchman, in the intrigues and indeed the tumults of that time. Presumably we don't know. I mean, we have a sort of idea that he was floating above that kind of thing. But maybe he did know and just thought that was not for him. We're most grateful to you for this very illuminating insight into what was, as you say, a formative time for the Church of England, and indeed for the institution of the Book of Common Prayer. And we're, of course, extremely grateful that now, in the 21st century, all is calm in the cathedral over which you preside in such a friendly manner. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. And I might also say, I very nearly met Dean Nicholas when I came here as vicar of the close, but he'd actually just left about 3 weeks before, so I never did until Thursday evening when we met in Sherborne, and of course today. So it's very good to get to know you. Thank you.